All right, good afternoon, everyone, or good morning to some of you, wherever you are, or good evening as well. I think we're all spread across different time zones. It is a pleasure to have you all joining us today for our inaugural intern presentation. This has been an exciting summer, past 8 to 9 weeks, hosting Reilly, Mach, and Morgan Sweeney, who will tell you a little bit more about themselves when they present, so I won't steal their thunder too much. But I want to just say a little bit about this brand new summer internship program with the leaning on research. And was an idea that Jess and I chatted about back in the spring, and we realized that this was an opportunity for us to create a program like this that would allow us to engage students, particularly undergraduates, that are thinking about public engagement and science communication broadly, especially with the research leaning side of it. And so we posted the position, the program, and Reilly Morgan applied, and we were really curious about their interest. And so we took a chance, and I'm actually thankful for them taking a chance on us to try this thing out, because it's purely experimental. So a huge thanks to also Jessica, who co-advised Morgan, and you'll hear a little bit more about her work in a little bit, and Reilly, who I mentored over the summer. And thanks to also the other members who presented throughout the summer. They went through a couple of events as well. So to give you a sense of the program, 8 weeks, and it was a combination of both informational, like professional development, and also research development as well. So they had a research project they were working on. At the same time, they were doing some professional development, so informational interviews. They were going through lectures. We had, as you see here at the bottom, quite a few. So Jessica gave a lecture, I gave a lecture, Adriana as well gave a lecture. And then most recently, they attended a conference, the Wonder Women in STEM conference hosted by Prasha. So that was a really great sort of ending point for them to see. So this is a working template right now. It will very much may change, it probably will change next summer. And we're already thinking about potential grants that we could use to advance and grow this. And so the feedback that we'll get from Reilly and Morgan will be super useful. And also from you as well, when you hear about their work. And so I will shut up now and pass it on to our first presenter, Reilly Mach, and she comes to us from Concordia College, and she's a rising, and correct me if I'm wrong, Reilly, rising junior there. And I'll stop there and let her tell you more about herself and her work. So Reilly, I'll pass on the stage to you.
Perfect. All right, hi everybody. Like Faniel said, I'm Reilly Mach. I'm one of the SAI interns this summer. Go to school at Concordia College in Moorhead, Minnesota, live in Fargo, North Dakota. In my summer, I spent studying the Journal of Stories in Science by SAI. So some of you might have heard of it, some of you may have not, and I'll talk more about it if you haven't, but the title of my presentation today is The Evolving Structure and Diversity of Human Narratives in Science. So just to begin with a little presentation overview here, I'll start with an introduction and background, then I'll do an overview of the database of Stories in Science. Then the three major content areas are structure and diversity, story readability, and reader engagement. And then I'll wrap up with the impact of the project and some takeaways. So just to begin with typical science storytelling. A lot of times what we think of science storytelling is publishing your data in peer-reviewed journals, magazines, things like that. And it's kind of become this idea of publish or perish. And that's what a lot of us think of as scientists. But the problem with publish or perish is where's the humanity? We get so caught up in publishing the science we've done that sometimes we forget about the person who's actually doing the science. And so that's one of the major issues with publish or perish, and why Stories in Science and other organizations have started to try and bring humanity to these aspects. So it's not just Stories in Science that's doing this. This is a growing field, and a lot more organizations are starting to have the same goals. So People Behind the Science podcast, Skype a Scientist, Story Collider, I'm a Scientist. And you can see some of these, like her STEM story, are specific to, certain people or certain groups, where that one would focus on women. Stories in Science specifically is kind of across the whole spectrum. And so I'll be talking about, where we're really strong, where we need a little bit more representation. But as more and more organizations are starting to tell their stories of these scientists, it's really important that we track and analyze what we already have and where we need to go. And that's what I'll be doing today. And then one of the goals of my summer project is to encourage other entities such as these shown here to try and do the same tracking of their own metrics. So in just another look at the growing field of storytelling in science, on the right here, you can see some of the different organizations that are doing this. And on the left, you can see what type of organization it is. So a lot of websites, a lot of podcasts, and Morgan will be talking about science podcasting, which is a super interesting and relevant field, blogs, nonprofits, vlogs, things like that. So Stories in Science is definitely not alone, but we will be the first ones to actually kind of produce an analysis of what we've already posted and kind of track where we're at. So specifically an overview of Stories in Science, there are on average 3 to 4 news stories per month, and the stories are typically about 1,000 words in length. So it's nothing super long. In 10 minutes, you can do a deep read of it and get the message. So that's really nice. In my analysis, there are 170 stories written by 158 authors, meaning some people wrote more than one story. But you'll see when we do the demographic analysis, each author is only counted once. And these stories, there's, I read all of them, and all of them have kind of a different message, but the overlying theme is just kind of, like I said, talk about the person behind the work. And, some people focus specifically on, here's one paper that was kind of the defining moment in my science career, but here's what I was going through during that time. Some people say, here's an aspect of my childhood that really got me interested in science in the first place. Some focus on their career as a whole and say, kind of just briefly go through all of it. But the stories are really interesting, not that long to read. So if you haven't checked them out, they're so interesting. But the overlying theme is just talking about who they are behind all their work. So kind of another look at that, what's being said in these stories. You can see the ones this is a word cloud of all the stories, and the words that stick out are, research, science, experience, students, stories. But I also wanted to bring up some of the things that will come up later. You can see struggles is kind of big, failure is kind of big. So it's not just saying, here's all the amazing things I did. A lot of the times these people want to focus on the struggles they went through, the challenges they faced, and that'll come up later in my presentation. But it's really interesting to see what people are actually saying in these stories. All right, so that's the introduction and background. So our first major content area is going to be structure and diversity of the database. In other words, who's saying what. So like I said, as more organizations are starting to produce their stories, it's important to track where we're at and where we should go. So some questions that come about are, who is writing their stories? What's their career stage? Where are they located? What are the stories about? And all those questions are things that we asked and wanted to analyze this summer. And like I mentioned, the problem with all these stories coming out is that a detailed assessment of the stories is missing. And so that was the goal of my project this summer. And we also want to inspire other organizations to do the same tracking of their stories. So the first graph I'm going to show you here, this is an alluvial plot of the database as a whole. And I know there's a lot here, but these are 3 different metrics. So you can see the first vertical black line is gender, then field, and then location. And each of these horizontal colored lines, the width is proportional to how many authors are actually in that cluster. So you can see we've got 67% women, and then mostly life sciences and mostly North America. So what we can see is we've got a bias towards life scientists from North America. And I'll break these down individually later, but this is kind of a good view of where the database as a whole is at, and it allows you to see, okay, this woman is in applied sciences, but she's from Europe. And so if you kind of follow that line there, you can see where our authors are actually from. And so here's another look at the gender breakdown here. And what we can see is that more women than men are sharing their stories. And this was really interesting to see, and it proposed the question, why is this? And honestly, we don't really know. There's no way to for sure say this is why more women are writing their stories. It could be because women face more challenges in STEM and are more likely to write their stories that other young women can hear what they went through. It also could be that a lot of these initiatives focus specifically on women, so they may have already heard of other organizations writing stories, but like I said, we really don't know for sure. It's just interesting to see. Next year, we're going to be looking at the author percentage by location. And so, you can see on the y-axis, we have the percentage of authors. And here we see that we have a bias towards North America, like you saw in the alluvial plot first. Over 60% of our authors are from North America, and then pretty much all the rest of the locations are under 10%. So that's something to keep in mind as we go forward, potentially trying to limit that bias and even those out a little bit. And similarly, we're going to see in the percentage by field, we've got a bias towards life sciences here. Kind of the same story, almost 60% are life sciences, and then the rest of the fields are under 10%. So just as we go forward, keeping those in mind and trying to reach out across the spectrum of science and get more people if we can. And it's likely that because Stories in Science, the editorial team, is mostly life scientists from North America, that probably contributes to the bias there, that we just kind of unintentionally attract those people. So this is a graph that wasn't shown in the alluvial plot, and this was one of the most interesting finds. Here you're looking at the career stage and representation, and there's a lot on this graph, so I'll kind of break it down into 3 main points. The first being that there's a diverse career stage representation. Unlike the previous few graphs, we don't have one spike that's sticking out among the rest. Here we've got a relatively equal representation, and actually, the lowest bar is high school, but Faneuil's been telling me that there's going to be a partnership with high schoolers doing research, and so we'll probably see that rise too and have that even more evened out there. And we can see here that most authors are graduate students, with over 23% being grad students, and most of our authors are from academia. But it's important to note that PhD non-academia is actually a rising category, and those are really interesting stories to read as well. So then another takeaway from this graph, you can see a big chunk is the other category, and you're probably wondering, who are they? And so these attributes were taken from a kind of Excel breakdown that Faneuil has been keeping track of, and the editors have been keeping track of since every story is posted. And they have a lot of these tags, and we didn't, put all the tags on here, but some of those are writers, parents, industry scientists. And so those, again, are really interesting stories to read, because sometimes they're not as connected to science as like a professor would be, but they're really interesting stories to read. And you can see that almost 20% fall into that other category. And then finally, from this graph, the last takeaway is that nearly a quarter of the authors are minorities who are shown to be underrepresented in health sciences. And so just keeping that in mind and trying to make sure that everyone's voice is heard as we're publishing these stories. So after structure and diversity, the next metric we measured was story readability. And our question here was, how do we see whether or not our stories are readable? And how we did this was using flash readability scores, which is an industry standard used to evaluate the readability of a document. So to kind of give you another look, this is from readable.com, which is actually the site that we use to gather the numbers. And so there are these standards equations that are used, and you'll see 2 different metrics here, the reading ease and the grade level. And both of these will come up as I talk about what we found later. But you can see that these numbers are determined based on sentence length and then number of syllables per word. So you put your document in there and it just tells you the score using these equations. So that was super nice. And then when we actually plotted our findings, you can see that here. And just to keep in mind, a 0 is readable only by college graduates, and a 100 is readable by your average 11-year-old student. So for us, the target readable range was 50 to 70, and that represents readability by high schoolers, grades 8 through 12. And what was really favorable for us is that 74% of our stories are in that target range. And we were really happy to see that, because we can do all this and publish all these stories, but if they're not readable by the people we really want to target, we're not really getting the message that we want to get. So that was super important. And that doesn't even include these stories above 70 that would be readable by high schoolers as well. And what this tells us, and I'll talk more about this later, is that there really is an avenue to implement these stories into a high school curriculum. So I will expand upon that later, but another kind of look at those same numbers, this is a histogram of the same graph, and here we have a bin width of 5, and you can see that we've got a normal distribution of scores. And this also was really favorable because we didn't want a lot of stories on the ends of the score spectrum. You know, these would be almost too easy that maybe you don't get the message. These would be so hard to understand that you can't even understand them. And so we were really happy to see that most of our stories were in this middle ground, and the 60 to 65 bin had the most stories, with over 40 of them being in that range. So the fact that most of our stories were in that target range was really positive takeaway from the analysis. So now I'll move on to reader engagement. And once again, the same question as before, how can we assess this? For our purposes of this analysis, we decided to use page views. And a page view, we just collected these from Google Analytics. And what it does is every time someone clicks on the link, that counts as a page view. So it doesn't tell you necessarily how long people are on the site or whether they're skimming or doing a deep read. But for our purposes, we just kind of wanted to get a sense of which stories are being clicked on the most. And when we actually plotted that data, here you can see what the results of that were. And these are published by story publication order, or graphed by story publication order. And kind of what we were trying to analyze from this graph is whether or not there's a way to see, you know, is there a certain aspect of a story that makes it go viral? And what we found here is that we don't really know which stories will be popular. You can see we have an outlier of almost 8,000, and then the next, there's a cluster kind of 2,500 to 3,000. And even with qualitative analysis of these stories, there wasn't like an it factor that made them go viral. It's kind of just random, and it could have something to do with the author's following and how many times it's been published on social media and things like that. But the takeaway from this is that we don't really know. And it's also interesting to note that when I published, or when I graphed these by descending page views, it actually showed a power law distribution, being that, you know, we had one way up here, a couple here, and then it kind of immediately dropped. So that was an interesting takeaway from this as well. But the overall message is that we can't really predict which stories will go viral. So now you've heard the content areas and what I actually found this summer, but the big question is, so what? You know, what does this mean? First, I want to emphasize that similar initiatives should follow suit and track their own metrics, you know, depending on what types of stories they publish, just thinking of what they should study and trying to produce a similar analysis. And that kind of leads into, for stories in science, the next 200 stories. What should they be? What will they be? And this is where we can keep in mind, you know, the biases that we do see from our database, and trying to think of those as we go forward. And then one of the biggest takeaways that I really find most interesting is the potential to implement these into a high school curriculum. So like I mentioned, almost 75% of our database is readable by high schoolers. So there really is the possibility and the avenue to try and get these out to high schoolers to read them. And so this paper called Even Einstein Struggled found that hearing struggle stories actually improve students' performance in science in terms of grades. And so in this paper, they had a struggle story group and an achievement story group. And the struggle stories were like, you know, Einstein did all these crazy things, but here's where he faced all these challenges. Here's where he had trouble. And the achievement story group heard, here's Einstein doing all these great things. And that's kind of what they heard. And the students who heard those achievement stories where it was just, you know, great things, their grades did not improve or actually went down. But when students hear those struggle stories of, you know, here's the challenges Einstein faced, he's not some god, their grades actually improved. And so that's why in the word cloud, I was kind of pointing out some of those bigger clusters of failure, struggles, because a lot of stories from Stories in Science talk about those challenges that these scientists face. And so there really is an avenue to do this. And so I think that's something that Stories in Science should focus on, and probably will focus on, just trying to get these read by students, because it really will help them out. So then where should we go next? We know what we should do. How do we do it? Number one, focus on diversifying the database through active outreach. And this could be outreach to universities, organizations, professional societies, and other groups worldwide. Once again, so we can try and limit those steep spikes that we have and even out our database if we can. Two, like I mentioned, consider implementation into the high school curriculum. I think that's one of the main things to focus on next. Three, consider more metrics to analyze engagement. For our purpose, page views work because we were just trying to get a sense of, do we know which stories will be popular, and kind of taking a look at which stories have been clicked on the most. But if we really wanted to, like an in-depth analysis of engagement, we'd have to think about a different metric besides page views. And then finally, like I've said, encourage other databases to track and disseminate their own metrics so that they know what they should focus on next. So some acknowledgements. I want to thank SAI, everybody at SAI, for this opportunity. During COVID-19, didn't exactly know what I was going to do because my summer plans got canceled, but I really have had a really great experience and it's been so fun. This is research different than anything I've done before, but I really had a great time. Specifically, Fanuel, Jessica, Noelle, and Morgan, kind of our four throughout the summer. Thanks for listening to all my presentations, and I don't know what to do here, so thank you guys. And then for my home institution, Concordia College, I want to say thank you to Dr. Chris Strand, providing me with funding and some resources from Concordia that I used throughout this summer. So that's what I have for you guys. Are there any questions?
Yay! Thank you so much, Reilly, for that presentation. We do have a time for some questions, so please jump in, and I guess you can raise your hand and unmute yourself as well and ask a question. And please don't be shy.
Reilly, what was your biggest takeaway from this data? Like I don't know, what are some thoughts you had in your head during and after that you're like, oh, this is something I want to bring into the rest of my life?
Yeah, well, I mean, like I said, this is different than anything I'd done before, but I really thought it was fun to do, like, I don't know how to say it, but it was almost like qualitative research, but quantitatively. Because I read all these stories and I had in my head, okay, well, here's the message, here's what they're saying. But it was really fun to try and think of ways, and I have to thank Fanuel for this as well, to think of ways where we could like actually numerically say, well, here's why people are saying this, or, here's why the stories are readable. Here's how many times they're being clicked. Because I could read these stories and say, this one is really interesting. I feel like that would be viral. But finding ways to like graphically represent what I had been reading was one of the most interesting things to me. And then kind of from the data specifically, like I mentioned, I thought one of the coolest parts was the high school aspect and kind of getting our readability and finding out that, these stories can definitely be read by high schoolers. And, trying to think of that was probably one of the coolest things that I found this summer.
Emily, and then Jim. So Emily first.
So great job. That was really, really interesting. So I'm just wondering, what do you think your ideal way to like integrate stories and science into a classroom would be? What do you think like a lesson plan would look like?
Yeah, well, and that's a good question. And I'd actually been talking to Caitlin, the new managing editor, about this. And, the thing about these stories is that, like I mentioned, they're about 1,000 words, and that's the average. So it doesn't take a super long time to do this. And so my first thought in thinking of, how could this be into a classroom is I almost thought of it as something like Fun Fridays in your science class or whatever, where, you take 10 minutes to read the story and then maybe have, 15, 20 to discuss in small groups and say, obviously, here's what we just read, but what was the takeaway? What did you find most interesting? And I think there really is a way to do that, taking just 30 minutes out of a class once a week. I think that's, that was just my first thought of, if I were in this class, that's what I would like to do, is get some time to read it and then discuss it with peers.
Jim?
Yeah, Reilly, that was awesome. I was just curious, is the written, if you were to have, say, written format, spoken format, or video format of stories, what would be your thoughts on engagement? Do you think you'd get more views on a video than say a web page? Because I've seen like a lot of stats on engagement levels for, say, audio versus video content, and video content gets higher conversion rates and journal engagement. And I'm just curious your thoughts there as a potential next step.
Yeah, that's a really good question, and that's actually, and Faniel can probably correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that's kind of a avenue that you guys are exploring and trying to think more about videos. And I actually watched, one of the video interviews that was produced on Stories in Science, and that is a really great question because videos are becoming more and more popular, and kind of similarly to podcasting, where you can play it in the car and listen to it through your radio. And so maybe there would be a higher turnaround. And I can't definitively say because I didn't look into that, but it's definitely something to consider. And I'd say that videos would be a good way to try and kind of increase our engagement, but also keep getting news stories.
Anybody else with a quick question?
Yes, it's a series of comments and not the questions.
Go ahead.
Should I just kind of briefly go through all of them?
Yeah, just briefly, right? Thanks.
Yeah. So first, I wanted to say, great job. This is super interesting.
Thanks.
You're welcome. So I guess a couple of notes I have is, so related to, now that I've said briefly, I feel a little lost, sorry. I'm just like, okay. So in terms of formatting, I know video formatting is being discussed, but something of concern in our city, I'm in St. Louis, is that kids' reading skills are not at par with where they're supposed to be, especially when they're going through K through 12. So maybe consider how kids' reading could be helped through these stories as one thing. Second thing is about engagement. You may want to consider media studies. I don't know. I don't have a whole lot of knowledge about it, but I mean, newspapers and television tell stories all the time. So they might have research and metrics that are more than page views that might be able to help you out. 3, you mentioned, I don't know what to call this, but it was really cool to read the stories and then put them into quantitative data. And that method is called mixed methods research.
Okay.
So you may want to explore that avenue if you want to. And the last thing I have is about why are women publishing more than men? That question, it could very well be explored with qualitative research if you go and talk to the persons and ask them. So people who are actually publishing the stories, and just ask them that question, or like a series of questions around that, and you may be able to get an idea of why that's happening.
For sure. Yeah, thank you so much.
Mm-hmm.
Fantastic. And Reilly, do you want to tell them about the paper very briefly? That we have one?
Yes, so we do have 2,500 words written, and it's just about ready to go. We're kind of doing the final, we're finalizing it, wrapping it up, which is super exciting. It'll be the first time I've ever written a paper for publication. So yeah, we have it written and kind of going into the next steps, which is really, really exciting.
Yeah, with that, I want to say thank you so much to Reilly Mach for her just tireless work over the last 8 weeks. And I do believe Dr. Strand is also on the line. Thank you as well for your help in getting Reilly with us this summer. And I look forward, this paper, yeah, we're gonna try to get it out there to get this question going about analysis and get other entities that are doing this work sharing their data. Most tracking their data. We're talking with the Journal of Emerging Investigators, it's a high school journal. This was Reilly mentioned earlier, and they're not even tracking this component. So we are going to collaborate with them and getting those stories included. And if you guys want to visit, all these stories are carefully tagged to death. So there's a nice search function on our website that allows you to combine all the categories and find a couple of stories that you can look into. And so with that, I want to say thanks again to Reilly and welcome our next speaker, Morgan Sweeney. And Morgan came to us from McGill, and she just graduated from there and moved back to the US recently. So she's in Chicago, but I'll let her tell her story and her work this summer. And she was mentored by Dr. Jessica Tsai. Thanks.
Cool. Thanks for the intro, Manuel. Okay, give me a sec to just share my screen with you guys. Okay. Okay. Hi, Hi everyone, my name is Morgan. I am the other summer intern that was working at SAI this summer, and I'm here to talk to you guys about the impact of science podcasts. So just real quick to walk you through what we're gonna explore in this PowerPoint, I'm gonna talk about how I found the question and what the question really was for my research, how I answered it, what methods I used to collect data, what I found, the data itself, and the information that came from this research, and what this means, what some of the takeaways are, what we've learned about the field of science podcasting as a result. So first, who am I and why do I care? As Fennel mentioned, my name is Morgan. I did just graduate from McGill and I studied cognitive science. So I love science. I've always been really interested in it, but my passion has been science communication since probably my second year of university. And I actually started my own science podcast called Magic of the Mind. And so what I do with my show is I take a topic from cognitive science or psychology and kind of write it into the center of a fantasy story. So I have like a whole cast of characters set in the world of Dungeons and Dragons that go on like fun adventures where there's always a conflict that has to do with some topic in psychology, whether that's memory, emotions, attention. It's a really fun way for me to kind of exercise that creative, but also the analytical part of my brain. And then I bring in a female researcher who studies that area of psychology, and they kind of explain how the theories I explored in the fantasy world relate to real life and to like our minds and our brains in the real world. It's a lot of fun. Check it out if you want. But just kind of to show like, I love science podcasts. That is kind of what I'm doing with my career now. And it's something that's so important to me. But you know, there's a lot of questions that come with it. So science podcasts and why they matter. Podcasts are a really popular media. They're relatively easy to start, relatively low cost. There's a sense of intimacy of listening to someone's voice in your ears as you're doing something. It feels like you have a friend. And they're especially popular for science communication because science, kind of like Reilly said in her presentation, is something that often in the publishing process, you take the humanity out. And with podcasts, you put the humanity back in, listening to someone's voice, listening to their story. So it's definitely a way that a lot of scientists and science organizations are trying to communicate with the public. However, even though there are so many science podcasts, one of the papers I read said there were over 900 science podcasts listed on Apple Podcasts. There's not a lot of data on their actual effects, on their impact in the world. And so that was something I thought would be really important to focus on. Podcasts are just one of many ways to kind of reach people, like Reilly was saying as well in her presentation. But it's really important when you're creating something, you want to know that what you're making actually has an effect and an impact on the world. And so measuring that impact of science podcasts was kind of what I was interested in doing for this summer project. But before I can measure the impact of science podcasts, I first have to figure out how I should even measure the impact of a podcast. A podcast isn't like a tangible thing. You don't see the people who are listening to it. Probably don't even know most of them. So this was a question of its own. How do you even measure the impact of a podcast? So downloads are the common metric in the industry. A download is kind of anytime someone downloads your episode or like streams it on any podcasting service, the download numbers go up from like wherever your podcast is hosted. So that's how most people count how many people have downloaded each episode. However, downloads can only tell you so much about how people are listening. Whether someone listens to 2 minutes or an hour of your episode, it will count for one download. And kind of on the flip side, as I've done, and I'm sure many of you have done, if you subscribe to a podcast and it automatically downloads those episodes, they're on your phone, but you probably haven't listened to them yet, and you might not actually end up listening to them. So it doesn't really have an accurate number for how many people have listened, and it definitely doesn't tell you anything about how deeply they've listened and how much they've like internalized it. And there's a lot of other ways to measure impact, and they measure a lot of different things. Apple Podcast Reviews tells you like how much people like your show, what their impressions are, the financial support that people give your podcast, whether that's like from brands and like advertising or like Patreon subscriptions, like people who are using their personal money to support something you're creating because they like it. These are other ways to measure impact that kind of measure different aspects of the word impact. And just figuring out how to choose which metric was a question of its own, and ended up being the question that I focused on for this project, just to set the groundwork for like, how do you even measure the impact of a science podcast? And it kind of seemed like a really good first step in learning what the impact of science podcasts are as a whole. So what we did to figure out how we should even measure the impact of science podcasts is we talked to the people whose job it actually is to measure the impact of their podcasts, science podcast producers. We decided to send out a survey that asked these producers how they measured the impact of their own shows. So they answered a bunch of questions and we took that data. To find the people that wanted to ask, we randomly selected 50 of the top 200 shows within the science category of Apple Podcasts. We use Apple Podcasts because that is the industry standard. That is where the largest number of podcasts are streamed and downloaded even today. And we decided to stick to the top 200 shows because it would decrease our probability of like randomly selecting a quote unquote dead show where like the producers are no longer actively producing it and probably wouldn't be as responsive. Also, because the top 200 is like the most popular in the field, some of the best of the field, we thought that they would have more experience and like more in-depth insights into the field than maybe a show that had like that was lower on the list and was still kind of figuring out how to do podcasting. So to collect this data, producers were emailed 3 times and contacted via social media twice. So it was pretty time intensive getting, just like having people take the survey. But that was a lot of fun. I was like figuring out how to track down different producers. So what we got, 19 out of the 50 producers that we reached out to did respond and take the survey, which is almost 40% response rate, which is honestly quite good for surveys, and especially in a field like this one where it's very all over the place. Yeah, I was really happy with that. I thought, you know, it's not a crazy large number, so we can't make any huge conclusions, but it definitely was representative of enough of the sample that I feel pretty confident in what we found so far. And these ranged from big name podcasts like NPR and NASA to like smaller, lesser known ones, but they were all, again, in the top 200. And yeah, so to keep in mind, all of the podcasts that responded are from the top 200 science podcasts in the Apple Podcast app. So this isn't representative of all science podcasts. It's just, this is what we've learned from the top 200. And that kind of even makes this data even more interesting, considering that this is like the top of the top. So just to show you, it's a fairly even distribution of like who responded. There is a small peak around 70, but it's not really skewed towards like the top 10 or the bottom 10. It is a fairly normal distribution. So I feel pretty confident that like the data we've gathered is representative of the top 200 podcasts, if not all science podcasts. Okay, so before I kind of tell you guys the impact stuff and like how science producers measure their own impact, there was some really cool data we just collected from these producers that I thought would be really interesting to share and kind of give you more of an insight into like the industry as a whole. So something I found really interesting was we collected the length of production, like how long these podcasts have been going on for. And there was a really notable U-shaped distribution. As you can see, and this is pretty common like across all podcasting, not just science podcasts, but it was interesting that it was here as well. There's a really high birth rate in podcasts. A lot of podcasts are being started, but something that podcasters and podcasting is notorious for is like a pretty high early death rate. The average number of podcasts as of, I think, 2019 is 6 episodes. Like the average number of episodes a podcast produces is 6, which I think says a lot about how dedicated some people are, but like how a lot of people just start it and then fizzle out pretty early on. So you can see there's this valley between 6 months and 3 years. But as you get to the 3 to 4 year range, it kind of starts to climb back up. Those people who have made it that far have amassed like enough of a social following and have just done it long enough that they have a space in that podcasting world. And then almost half of the podcasts that responded have been going on for 5 years or more. So I think this really shows like the skew in the top 200 podcasts that like you have to be in it for 5 years or more to really have a space for yourself and be there consistently, which I thought was so interesting and really not what I was expecting to collect from the data. But yeah, it's a long-term game. We also surveyed to see if it was the full-time job of the producers or not. And only a quarter of those who responded, again, a quarter of the shows in the top 200 podcasts in Apple Podcasts under the science category, 1/4, 1 out of 4 people actually did this as their full-time job, which means that 3/4, the vast majority of people had a top ranked podcast that they just did as a side gig, as a side hustle, as like something they just did for fun, which was really mind-blowing to me. Something even more interesting was of those who it was their full-time job, 80%, so 4 out of the 5 who it was their full-time job, had been producing this podcast for 5 years or more. And to me, this really indicated, like, if you want to make podcasting your full-time job, you have to put in like 5 years to really expect to have a full-time job in it, to be able to make enough money, to have like enough of an established presence. And that was really illuminating and kind of unexpected. So that was a really big takeaway for me, was like, wow, if I want to do the science podcasting thing full time, like, you got to be in it for the long haul. Okay, so now getting to the actual data of like, how do science podcasters measure the impact of their shows? So the way that we collected this data was we asked a multiple choice question: how do you measure the impact of your show? And we asked producers to choose up to 3 options. So as you can see with downloads, it's like around 19, which means almost every producer chose that one. But people were able to choose more than one, so that it'd be like a more equal distribution, so that we would see like what different people prioritized, higher and lower. And the top 3, but kind of 4, because the third one tied, measures that people use are downloads, far and above. Like, people really use downloads, and that might partially be because that's what advertisers use. Like, if you want to have someone pay you to like put an ad on your show, advertisers like to know how many people have downloaded it. Apple Podcast reviews is number 2, seeing how people like respond to your show. And then audience contact, which is when someone like emails you or writes you a personal message on social media, tied with financial support for number 3. So yeah, I think it kind of showed that people really care what other people think and like how other people respond to their show. But yeah, downloads was the biggest one, which kind of makes sense. It is the industry standard. And then we decided to break down this data using the measures that we'd found previously for like whether or not it was a full-time job and how long the podcast had been going on. So first, I'm just going to remind you guys that 1/4 of the people we surveyed were podcasters, like they produce a science podcast as their full-time job, and 3/4 did not do it as a full-time job. So what, like, the data is definitely skewed towards those being not their full-time job, but we're still able to make a couple conclusions from like the distribution of whether or not it was their full-time job and how they responded to the impact. So as you can see here, for those who it was their full-time job, they were more interested in audience contact. Like, the proportion of full-time to not full-time was higher. And they were more interested in corporate support. So they really cared about what like the people who listened to their show told them about it. And it was important to them that they had like financial support, whether that's advertising or branding collaborations. But what I thought was really interesting was, for those who it was their full-time job, they put a lot less emphasis on social media and Apple Podcast reviews, which, because those can be like people who maybe haven't, like, if someone does an audience contact, like emails you or writes you a personal message, it's very clear that they've been listening to your show for a long time, or they have really strong opinions about it. Whereas Apple Podcast reviews and social media contact are kind of, I don't know, they're more shallow. You can just listen to one episode and like add them on Twitter or leave a review kind of like nonchalantly. So these people who it was their full-time job tend to put less emphasis on those forms of feedback. And then we decided to break it down by like the production. Coincidentally, though, the breakdown ended up being the same distribution of like 1/4 and 3/4. This wasn't a mistake, that's just how it is. I decided to break it down into like older podcasts and younger podcasts, and I made the cutoff at 2 years because that was kind of where the data seemed to differ. So again, 1/4 of the podcasts had been produced for 2 years or less. Those were the young podcasts. And 3/4 of the podcasts who responded had been going on for 2 years or longer, and those were the old podcasts. So as you can see here, young shows put a lot less emphasis on audience contact, again, emailing or personal messages, surveys, which is when you survey your audience to see what they think, what their feedback is, what they've learned, and in-person interactions, which is when someone comes up to you, whether on the street or someone in your family, and it's just like, talks to you about your podcast in person. This might be partially because young shows haven't been around for quite as long, so they might not have the audience base that you kind of need to do like contact or in-person responses or even surveys. But I also think this might be representative that like shows that have been going on for a longer time tend to put more emphasis just in these measures of impact, which to me seem kind of deeper, like they have more depth. When you're surveying someone what they've learned, how they've listened, you get a lot more data on like one person's interaction with your show. Same with in-person interactions. If someone comes up to you and is like, I love your podcast, there's this thing you did that was so cool, and like I love the sound design or whatever, like it tells you a lot more about their personal interaction with your podcast and their relationship with the thing you've created than like downloads would, for example. So I think that's really important that the shows that have been going on for a longer period of time put more emphasis on those like deeper measures and less on some of the more shallow measures. Yeah, okay. And so we also had some qualitative data. There were a couple like open answer questions where podcast producers got to just write. The question we asked was, what other tools or like things would you like to learn to measure the impact of your show? This is a word cloud we made from that data. So as you can see, they're really interested in their listeners, in improvements and engagement, experiences. Yeah, and I kind of broke this down through like a qualitative data analysis in the next slide, but it's just cool to see it. Look at all those words. They love podcasts. It's very fun. Okay, so what producers were really curious and kind of wanted more information about how shows compared to their peers. There's not really a way, aside from like the Apple Podcast ranking system, to see like how your podcast compares with others in your niche. Aside from like messaging the producer and being like, hey, how many downloads do you guys have? Which isn't really done. People are really curious about the demographic of their audience, of their listeners. This is a big hole in the literature as well that I saw when I was reading through. Like, there really isn't a lot that's known about the people who tend to consume science podcasts. And I think this is really interesting because when you're thinking about podcasting as a way to reach the public, you really need to know if like your podcast is actually reaching the public or if it's reaching like scientists or people who are already involved in science versus someone who maybe never would have come across science or doesn't use science in their day-to-day life when you're measuring the impact of something. A lot of podcasters also wanted to have like more in-depth data about how their listeners listen to their show. They wanted to know like what exactly is listened to, what parts people like more than others. They really wanted to know what their listeners actually took away from, what they learned. And they were really interested in ways to increase engagement and feedback from their listeners. It seemed like this is really what podcasters want, is to just hear their listeners' experience and learn what they can do better. So my takeaways were there are a number of different ways to measure impact, and they all kind of measure different aspects of impact, which makes it even more challenging to figure out like which one you want to use for future research. I learned that science podcasts are super time intensive if you expect to be successful, and what they define success as like on the top charts or having it as your full-time job and main source of income. Like success is completely defined however you want it, but to make it to those like higher levels of the industry, you really have to put in a crazy amount of time that I just hadn't known going in. I found it really interesting that even top ranked podcasts are for the most part not full-time jobs. Like these people just do it on the side, even when they've made it pretty high up there. And it was also really interesting how many questions that science podcast producers had. Like they're really interested in learning more about their listeners, about their quality, about their own impact. They really want to know more data. And the field definitely needs to know more data if it wants to grow and if it wants to reach people that, yeah, that might not already be interested in science. And then I wanted to thank Fanuel and Jessica for their mentorship during this program, Reilly and Noelle for constantly being supportive and just helping with everything along the way. It's been a lot of fun to do this project with you guys. I want to thank the podcast producers for responding to me. That was cool. They took some time out of their day and took a survey, which was really nice. And to all you guys for like coming and watching and like making SAI possible. I had just graduated when everything was canceled. It was COVID, like the whole world was shut down. I had no idea what I was going to do with my summer, but finding this community and this group of people who wanted to bridge the gap between science and society, which is like what I want to do with my career and like my future, it was really cool to like stumble upon this place and like be able to do this project. So thank you all.
Yay. Thank you, Morgan, for that presentation. I want to open the floor up for questions. Please unmute yourself. Raise your hand first so I can point at you, and then you can ask your question away. Jim.
Yeah, so I just had a quick question. Were any of these podcasters that you took a survey also co-producing their podcasts on YouTube? Because views on YouTube is often a good proxy for engagement and impact as well.
For sure. That honestly, I just didn't take that in. Most of them weren't, I think. None of them that I remember seemed to have like cross-platform distribution, but that wasn't any of the data that I was analyzing. But it would be an interesting thing to see is like the crossover between podcasting and video. Also like vodcasting is like a really common like thing that people are doing. Less now, it was really big like 3 years ago, but yeah, it would be interesting to see the overlap and how engagement changes between like audio and video.
Yeah, and I was just asking that because I know with YouTube, sometimes you can break it down by gender and age and things like that with viewership. So it'd be really cool to figure out a way to do that.
Yeah, and it's interesting because actually Spotify lets you do that. They tell you age, gender, but again, Spotify is like, it only has, I think, 8% of the podcast listening share. So it's really not, most listeners don't come from Spotify. So you're really not able to get that kind of data across the board.
Great. Israel?
Hi, Morgan. I enjoyed your presentation.
Thank you.
One question that I had was, like, I don't know if this came across in your research at all, but with those podcasts that were more popular, what measures did they take to like reach that level of fame, I want to say? I know that like most of them probably have been there for like years and stuff like that, but were they like leveraging like any sort of social media to like get to their sort of population or like their population of interest and other things?
That's a good question. Yeah. I honestly, again, that wasn't one of the things like I took data from. So this is just kind of my own like experience and like gut instinct is like how I'm responding. But I think, so the thing about podcasting is it's been around for a really long time. The first podcasts were coming out in like 2008 before like people would just play it on their iPods. And so there definitely is, like for podcast starting now, if you want to make it big, it definitely helps to have a social media platform or to have people who like know your name, know your brand, and are interested in content you create. But a lot of the podcasts that like were the ones that were randomly selected tended to be with larger organizations, whether that was NASA, whether that was NPR, iHeartRadio had a couple of them. So like, I think there's a lot of ways to like make it and make your podcast popular enough and like have enough listeners or, you know, make it in the industry. And I think social media fame is one of them, definitely. But I think also having like a network or a company that supports your podcast is another way that a lot of people have gone about it, or like a professional organization. There was one that was like a med student. It was for med students, and it was supported by, I think, like the MCAT Prep Society or whatever. So there's a lot of different ways to do it, for sure. But social media, especially for the podcast that I've been starting recently, is a really popular way that people try to make it more popular. Yeah.
Thank you. Sorry.
Yeah, no problem.
Reilly?
So my question is just kind of out of curiosity. Obviously you had your takeaways. Are there any, you know, of those takeaways that you will specifically think of when you're producing your podcast? Or is there any like specific findings that made you rethink the way you do things? Anything like that?
Yeah, I mean, I'm definitely going to survey. So right now I'm working on the second to last episode of the season. But with my final episode, I'm definitely going to be releasing a survey that I'll say, like, if you fill out the survey, I'll like send you a free sticker.
Okay.
So it definitely made me want more data from my personal listeners, and seeing like what they like, what things they're interested in, how I can better engage with people who listen to my podcast. I would say it definitely made me look more long-term at like my podcasting career, as in like, it's okay, my show's not going to make it in a year. Like, I don't have that kind of corporate backing or the social media presence to like do that. But if you just keep at it and stick around for long enough and have a team of people who like what you're doing, and like somewhat like, you know, you build it over time. And I think in some ways that kind of made me feel a bit less like I have to do it all right now, and a bit more like, you know, this is season 1. This is like where I'm starting out. And then I want to do and like grow and create new things as it keeps going. But it kind of lowers the bar of expectation for me a little bit, as like, oh, like if I make it to 3 years, then I can kind of expect to see some returns on my investment. But it just kind of like showed me like it's a long-term game you're playing, not really. Like, I think a lot of people think like you're gonna make a podcast, you're gonna make it big, you're gonna make so much money, but like anyone who actually does podcasting knows it's a long grind and it's not rewarding until, well, it's rewarding in its own way. You have to like podcasting for podcasting, not for what you're going to get out of it. And that's why so many shows die so early on, I think. It's because people are like, I can make a podcast, it's just talking into a microphone. There's actually a lot of work in production and in networking and marketing to actually, like, if you want to make it big and make something out of it. So that was a big takeaway for me. Also, just doing this research, this is the first research project I'd ever done. Like I study cognitive science, but I spent most of my spare time doing like science communication stuff because I knew that was what I was interested in. So I never like researched in a lab or anything like that. And this is really fun to do, and to take data and to analyze it and to make conclusions from things that I had found, that it's like, no one in the world knows this. Like, I'm the only one who has this data. I just felt very powerful, and it was interesting. It also made me like, there's a grad program I'm thinking about applying to that would be more like media studies or communication studies, where I could analyze the audiences of different like science medias and see like what gaps there are, like who's being reached with science media, and how to kind of creatively make it more inclusive and more, just like better, because there's a lot of issues in the field, and I think it'd be interesting to study them and be able to talk about them with even more data. Yeah.
Yes, and data is the order of the day. Thank you, Reilly, for that question. So my last sort of quick question for you is thinking about like you as a podcaster, what change do you actually wish to see out there in your listeners? And I think this is the question that a lot of podcasters are asking themselves, actually just everyone, right? What is the actual impact, right, that you hope, what is the change in behavior, if it's that you want to see, that will tell you, yes, this is the impact that I want to have, and it's actually happening. And it's a hard question, so you may not know, but I'm just curious.
Oh no, I totally know. I think you really have to, when you're making a podcast and you're putting in all the work to it, you really have to know what you want to get out of it. Otherwise, you're going to give up real quick. And for me, for my podcast personally, because my podcast is kind of a bridge between like psychology and fantasy, and also because like in my personal life, I'm a yoga teacher and I read a lot about, spiritual wellness and just like personal growth. That's been a big part of my life for a couple of years. I try to kind of combine all of them into my show. And so what I really want people to take away, like a wonder of the world. Like that's something that I've always found from fantasy, just like the beauty and the, creativity of like different magical worlds that you can immerse yourself into. But I also want people to take away like things that psychologists have revealed about like our day-to-day life and like how our minds work. The episode I'm working on right now is about relationships, and there's a lot of really cool findings about like ways to create more healthy relationships and like factors that can predict how long a relationship will last, and ways, it's really cool to have these takeaways that you can take into your own everyday life. And then so for this episode in particular, like I want the takeaway to be like relationships are really important. It's not like a thing you do on the side when you're like not working. It's like, this is what we're made for. And without kind of having other people in our life, humans aren't as strong or like it really has an impact on your mental health if you don't have a lot of like close relationships in your life. So I don't know, I guess I want people to take away both like life lessons and like things that they can hopefully do in their own lives to make themselves happier or more connected with the world, or at least at the very least like their minds and their bodies. But as well as like, yeah, like an appreciation for like the people who do science and the process of science and how it's flawed, and then just the wonder and magic and beauty and like hopefully connection to the characters I create. With fantasy, you really have to build a world, and you have to make, because it's not a real world. So you have to make all the things within it pretty cohesive and like realistic. Otherwise it all kind of falls apart. So yeah, my objective is kind of threefold, but I think every podcast has its own audience, has its own objective that it's trying to fulfill. And that's mine because it's based on like who I am and what my interests are, and what me personally, if I were looking for a podcast, like this podcast is for me, but like also other people who are interested in similar things.
Right. And I think that's an interesting point that you make it, start with yourself. What is the change you seek from yourself? And then looking outside as well. And as you know, I always tell this of the fellows, now the interns, it's about, how do you then measure those changes that you seek to create in the world? And that's always a challenge, but it's something that you got to work towards and trying to get those metrics. And with that, I think, as Morgan mentioned earlier, we're hoping to create these opportunities for undergraduates to have these research experiences in SciComm, in public engagement, the research part of it. Okay, and this is something that we feel is not really there at the grad level. There is, and so we're hoping that this program will continue on next summer, and we're going to be writing for grants as well moving forward, and hopefully get those funding to grow it and give more funding so that students can spend more time doing this kind of research, going depth, right? And this is the first step. You've noticed both of them, their projects are, Morgan's going to continue working on this, to get the paper and maybe even add more data, but the stage has been set for that. And same thing with Reilly as well. There's a ton more data that we have that she didn't talk about, and we looked into it, like the number, how long people read the story. 2 minutes is the magic number. We know that, but Google gives you all these other metrics that we're going to be looking into as well. And so with that, I want to thank both of you guys, and it's been a fantastic summer. Thank you to all of you for listening to them. And so that concludes the formal part of the presentation, and I'm going to stop the recording at this point in time.